समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
So, what is going to happen next in Venezuela? Venezuela is undergoing a historic moment, arguably the most dramatic political rupture the country has seen since Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. If you've been following my work, you would know I have long argued that the fall of Nicolas Maduro was just a matter of time. Still, few could have predicted that his downfall would unfold in the almost cinematic fashion we witnessed on January 3rd. Now, enough has been said about Maduro's ouster, US's dadagiri, and violation of international law. Many parallels have been drawn with how China or Russia would view it, but that's another story for another day. In this explainer today, I will break down the events and what they mean in 7 clear parts so that you understand not just what happened, but why it matters for Venezuela, for Latin America, and for India. So let's begin. Part 1 is about the current situation. Now, on January 3rd, the United States carried out an operation that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. They were flown to the United States to stand trial on 4 major charges: narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess those weapons. Washington described the move as a surgical law enforcement operation against a fugitive from American justice. Hours later, in a New York courtroom, Maduro insisted he was still the legitimate president of Venezuela, pleading not guilty and proclaiming that he remained the head of state. But back in Caracas, which is the capital of Venezuela, events were unfolding without him. Delcy Rodriguez, Venezuela's vice president since 2018, was swiftly sworn in as interim president. The parliamentary session began with emotional denunciations of what Maduro loyalists called the kidnapping of their president. Rodriguez, visibly affected, pledged to continue governing while calling for Maduro's release. Now, this sudden leadership shift has plunged the country into uncertainty. Is this the beginning of a democratic transition or the start of a deeper chaos? Can the US work with longtime Maduro loyalists like Rodriguez? Will Chavismo, basically an ideology that has dominated Venezuela for 25 years, maintain its grip over the state? At his press conference after the operation, President Trump announced that the United States would take charge of Venezuela and expected Rodriguez to cooperate. Now, whether she will do it, and if so, how, remains unclear. Let's come to part 2, how Maduro was captured. Much has been already written about this extraordinary operation, now officially known as Operation Absolute Resolve. But key details emerged during a press briefing at Mar-a-Lago, where Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane revealed just how extensive the mission planning had been. For months, the US intelligence agencies built what operatives call a pattern of life for Maduro: where he slept, what he ate, what he wore, how he moved, who guarded him, etc. CIA teams were inserted into Venezuela months beforehand. Rehearsals simulated everything down to building layouts and guard rotations. According to Kane, the precision of intelligence, not firepower, was what made the operation succeed. The Venezuelan security apparatus hardly reacted. The Russian and Chinese weapons, the Russian air defenses fell short of expectations, and 32 Cubans died in US strikes. And that brings us to the next part. Why were Maduro's bodyguards Cuban? And what about the Cuba-Venezuela nexus? For decades, Cuba has essentially run Venezuelan intelligence, parts of its military structure, much of its presidential security apparatus as well. Foreign diplomats have long reported that Maduro's closest security personnel spoke Spanish with Cuban accents. Maduro, who studied in Havana in his youth, trusted Cuban advisors more than Venezuelans. This arrangement was not ideological, but also transactional. The Cuba-Venezuela exchange, for years Venezuela sent Cuba billions of dollars worth of oil, a lifeline after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Cuba sent Venezuela intelligence operatives, military advisors, doctors, and bureaucrats. In fact, Hugo Chavez famously declared that Cuba and Venezuela were La Gran Patria, which means one homeland. But Maduro's capture has placed this alliance on the brink of collapse. Early Monday morning, Cuba announced that 32 Cuban security officers died in the US strike that preceded Maduro's apprehension. Flags were lowered to half-mast, and millions of Cubans woke up fearing that the oil shipments, some 30,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, might stop. Now, Russia also sends approximately 2 million barrels per year to Cuba, which is not quite much, and whether that will continue is still unknown. With a new, harsher Monroe Doctrine, now called the Dunroe Doctrine, which is guiding US policy, it seems, Trump has already signaled that the United States will not tolerate hostile actors in the Western Hemisphere, which means Cuba might be next in Washington's crosshairs. Coming to part 4, why does the US call Maduro illegitimate? To understand Venezuela's political vacuum, we must also revisit Maduro's legitimacy. On July 28, 2025, which is last year, opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez defeated Maduro at the polls. Nevertheless, Maduro refused to accept defeat and remained in power with military support. The United States, interestingly, did not reinstall Gonzalez after capturing Maduro, nor did it recognize popular opposition figure Maria Machado. Instead, Washington accepted a short-term transitional government under Delcy Rodriguez. I just told you about her, and she happens to be a Maduro protege. This means that Chavismo, the political movement and ideology created by Chavez, still maintains its grip on the state even without Maduro physically being present. So in other words, Maduro is gone, but Maduroism is not. And now let's come to the most important part, the oil factor. President Trump has already promised that US oil companies will move into Venezuela to restore the country's collapsed infrastructure and, in his usual way, start making money for the country. But, it is important to understand what is real and what is not about Venezuela's oil potential. Now, it is true that Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia. In the mid-20th century, it was the world's largest oil exporter. Yet today, production is a shadow of what it once was. Why? The collapse after 1999 is important to revisit. When Chavez introduced socialism in 1999, the national oil company, the PDVSA, was purged, politicized, and mismanaged. Corruption metastasized. Infrastructure decayed. By the time Maduro took over, the industry was already in structural freefall. And there are also certain myths about quick recovery. An American heavy oil expert with years of experience working on Venezuelan projects recently debunked the idea that Venezuela can suddenly flood the market with oil. There are certain key realities. For example, the heavy oil geology in Venezuela is extremely difficult. There are literally zero SAGD projects, which is a technology Canada uses to make heavy oil viable. Then greenfield development would cost about $30,000 per flowing barrel. That means a $1 billion investment for every 30,000 barrels a day increase. Then corruption and logistical nightmares drove countless Venezuelan engineers and specialists to leave the country. US producers are locked into budgets until the third quarter of the year. So what it means is that estimates are that it would take at least 3 years to double production, adding about 1 million barrels per day. And it is definitely not easy as it sounds. Crucially, the US Midwest already processes about 4 million barrels a day, which comes mostly from Canada. So Venezuela has neither the infrastructure nor the logistics to displace that supply anytime soon. So while Venezuela's oil is important, it is not a switch that can be flipped overnight. Now let's talk a little bit more about the regional fallout. Now we already discussed Cuba. Now let's come to Colombia and the ELN factor there. So another country that feels the shockwaves of Venezuela's crisis after Cuba is Colombia. Now, Colombia has already absorbed nearly 3 million Venezuelan refugees out of the roughly 8 million who fled the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. The last major migration wave during Juan Guaido's failed uprising in 2019 against Maduro triggered one of the largest humanitarian exodus in the Western Hemisphere. Today, Colombia is worse prepared. You know why? Because it lost 70% of humanitarian funding after the Trump administration shut down the US aid programs last year. Also, relations between the Trump administration and President Gustavo Petro have deteriorated sharply. Petro is the current president of Colombia. And the US has recently sanctioned Petro, with Trump calling him a thug and illegal drug dealer. Now, following Maduro's capture, Colombia condemned the US operation and began fortifying its 2,200-kilometer border. But the bigger threat doesn't really come from the official military in Colombia, but actually from the National Liberation Army, or the ELN, a left-wing rebel group deeply tied to Maduro's government and heavily involved in cocaine trafficking. You know, the ELN controls much of the Colombia-Venezuela border, and it had vowed to defend Venezuela against imperialist aggression. Now, it's another thing that it could not. It has also bombed Colombian state facilities in December, and the ELN is preparing retaliatory action against Maduro's removal. Now, Colombia's Ministry of Defense has activated all security forces, at least reportedly, to prevent terrorist attacks and protect embassies and secure border regions. But the fear is that Venezuela's instability could spill over, which means more refugees, more violence, more opportunities for armed groups such as the ELN to expand. Therefore, Colombia may soon face the largest refugee and security crisis in Latin America's recent history. And now let's come to the last part, which is the implications for India's energy security. You know, after years of volatility in India's oil procurement caused by unending conflicts in West Asia, the US move to take control of Venezuela's oil sector could offer New Delhi a significant strategic opening, provided it navigates the situation carefully. Following the US operation that captured Maduro and his wife, President Trump announced that Washington would assume oversight of Venezuela's oil industry and channel billions into rebuilding its broken infrastructure. Now, the ripple effects were immediately visible in Indian markets. Shares of Reliance Industries climbed 1% on 5th January, touching a 52-week high, while state-owned ONGC gained around 2% in early trading, both companies having past exposure to Venezuelan crude and assets. India's imports of Venezuelan oil plummeted after US sanctions in 2019, shrinking from over $6 billion in 2019 to just about $0.64 billion in 2020. A decade earlier, which is about 2013, Venezuelan crude accounted for nearly 10% of India's oil basket, with bilateral trade reaching about $13 billion. Now, there is also a factor of the unresolved issue of unpaid dues. Now, for instance, ONGC Videsh, which owns 40% of the San Cristobal oil field, is still owed roughly $500 million in dividends, payments that stalled once sanctions took effect. Renewed US control raises hopes that these liabilities could finally be cleared. But to sum up, there is much that needs to be answered. The next hearing in Maduro's US trial is scheduled for March 17. Until then, the world is watching a political experiment unfold. Will Delcy Rodriguez cooperate with Washington or defy it? Will the transitional government hold or collapse? What will Trump's next moves be towards Cuba and Colombia? And can Venezuela begin a transition to democracy, or is it just another cycle of authoritarianism beginning? These questions sit inside one another like concentric circles. Venezuela at the center, surrounded by Cuba, Colombia, the Caribbean, oil markets, and global geopolitical tensions. The only certainty is that the situation is evolving fast. What happens to Nicolas Maduro is only the beginning of a much larger story, and I'll be back to discuss that more. Stay tuned.